Today, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce to you an idea that I find very useful in making sure that my intermediate to advanced level learners are not just learning how to speak in English, but more importantly, they are learning how to communicate in English. As I have said in previous mini lectures, when learning a second language, many people have the desire to become confident and competent communicators in the target language, and not just have the ability to speak the target language. And this is where QASIR comes in. But what is QASIR, I hear you ask? Well, it's a way of ensuring that your students are developing a well-rounded ability to communicate in English. It works on the premise that learning how to communicate in a socially and culturally appropriate manner is of vital importance to developing second language fluency. It encourages students to not only think about the words, phrases, and structures they are using, but also about the setting, the people involved, and the social or cultural norms of a given utterance or act of communication, etc. Now, without going into too much detail, this concept actually came to me a few years ago while working with adult students. I realized that many of my students, who had studied English for many years, lacked the ability to communicate effectively, even though they could speak and understand English quite well. This realization then prompted me to do some in-class research, where I really analyzed what mistakes my students were making in regards to communication. From this ongoing observation process, which lasted about 2 years and involved hundreds of adult students, mainly from Korea and Japan, I then devised ways that I could help my students develop better communication skills. Then, over the next 2 years, I gradually developed and refined my QASIR approach to teaching intermediate to advanced level learners how to communicate better. During the course of my in-class action research, I realized that in many cases, it was not a student's English ability, i.e. their knowledge of grammar or lexis, that prevented them from being good communicators. Often it was the fact that they just didn't really understand how to conduct a conversation or communicate effectively in English. They didn't think about the importance of asking questions or have the opportunity to develop fluency and confidence in starting or carrying on a conversation. And many students didn't really adhere to socially appropriate forms of communication, etc. It also became apparent that students would often just transplant the communication conventions they were used to from their mother tongue and culture straight into English. And as you can imagine, this approach often had some very interesting outcomes. And because of this, I decided to devote a substantial amount of time developing and honing a way to really help my students become better communicators. But anyway, I digress. Back to the question, what is QASIR? Well, QASIR stands for questions, answers, statements, interjections, and relevance. And it encourages both the teacher and the students to consider all of these factors while engaging in acts of communication. So now let's break it down into its constituent parts, just to show you what I mean. First, questions. Take a moment to think. Are your students good at asking questions? Do they ask appropriate questions? Are these questions relevant to the conversation? Do these questions open up a conversation or close it down? Do your students understand the value of questions for building rapport or forming friendships, etc.? Do your students ask too many questions? Are their questions culturally and socially appropriate? Now, for some of us out there, we may not have even thought about the value of teaching our students how to ask the right type of questions at the right time and in the right manner, or how helping our students develop the skill of asking good questions can really contribute to our students' ability to communicate. But I think we should. Let me give you a little anecdote to show you what I mean. One of my students, who speaks very good English, was always worried when he went to the USA for work, because he had to make small talk at business conferences, etc. He told me he was fine with giving presentations, and he was also fine talking about work. And from my own in-class observations, I can tell you he was very good at answering questions. His grammar was fine, a few little mistakes, but nothing that meant I couldn't understand him. And his word choice and usage was very good. He could easily be understood and was a very interesting guy, if you're asking him questions. But after recording his lessons for 3 lessons straight, so about 3 hours of one-on-one conversation practice, I had the perfect opportunity to show him that he was only asking an average of 4 questions a class, and always waited to answer questions as opposed to taking the initiative and asking questions. 4 questions a class. That's about 1 question every 15 minutes. As this little story shows, his weakness was not his words or grammar. He found it hard to communicate because he never engaged with the other person. He just replied when spoken to. He never asked questions. He always waited for his conversation partner to take the lead. He was not active in the conversation. And, as he said, often his inability to carry on a conversation led to many awkward silences. He thought it was his English knowledge or lack of vocabulary, etc. But it turns out it was his lack of understanding of how questions are used that led to poor communication. It was a classic case of misdiagnosis on behalf of the teachers, always correcting his grammar and giving him more words and phrases to use, instead of looking at the core of his communication problems, his inability to ask questions. This reluctance to ask questions was, as he suggested, probably a result of how he learned English in a teacher-centered way. So, what did we do? Well, for the next 4 weeks, we really focused on asking questions. At first, even if he went off topic, I didn't care. I just let him get comfortable leading a conversation and asking questions. Eventually, he learned how to lead a conversation and ask suitable questions, and now he feels confident in a variety of social situations. Grammar and lexis? No. The art of asking questions? Yes. So remember, team, a lack of grammar or lexis may not be the root cause of your students' problems. Now let's move on to answers. Many students find answering questions easier than asking questions. This could be because of the way many teachers teach. That is, with the teacher often firing questions at the students, so the students get a lot of practice answering questions. Or it might be because of cultural norms or expectations of the student, etc. Actually, there could be a host of reasons why students often find answering questions a little easier. But regardless of the reasons, if your students are good at answering questions, then that's great. But for those of us who have students who find answering questions difficult, then here are a few tips and ideas for you to think about. First, your student might be shy or embarrassed about making a mistake. So make sure your classroom and learning environment is one that welcomes and embraces errors. After all, an error is the first step towards learning. Second, listen. Listen to your students' answers and make sure that the answer they give really matches the question asked. I can't tell you the number of times I have seen teachers allow students to get away with giving the wrong answer. And I'm not talking about wrong grammar or wrong word choice. I mean, students are there to learn that. That's what we do as teachers. And honestly, most teachers are good at picking up on that. And that's all well and good. And I'm also not talking about wrong, as in getting a question wrong, like 1 + 1 is 3. No, I'm talking about instances where a teacher might ask, "What is the date today?" And the student says, "Wednesday." And the teacher just says, "Yes, good job, it's Wednesday," even though that was not the question asked. The teacher's not even interested in making sure the student can differentiate between the sounds of day and date. Maybe the student misheard, or maybe they can't distinguish the difference. But the teacher should be checking this, making sure the student is understanding and answering appropriately. Now, of course, this is just a simple example, and my point is this. As teachers, our job is to be engaged in the lesson and look for ways to help our students. And this could be as simple as realizing that a student needs help ensuring the response given matches the question asked. Finally, make sure your students learn to give answers that are socially acceptable and suitable for the moment. For example, when someone asks how you are in English, make sure your student knows that this is a greeting and a short answer is usually required. Unless, of course, you are talking to someone you know really well. Then a longer reply might be warranted. Let me give you an anecdote to illustrate my point. Yeah, I know, a second anecdote. I'm on a roll. Anywho, During my research into QASIR, I noticed that there were occasions where I would ask a student how they were, and then have to sit through a 2-minute monologue listening to them actually tell me. What the? I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting a short reply. And to me, this was terrible. Not because they were telling me about their day, or talking for too long and breaking the cultural norms of conversation and communication that, up until this point, had worked so well for me. And actually worked so well for most English speakers. Not at all. I wasn't upset about that. It was terrible because no teacher had ever corrected them or mentioned that some questions, like the one I had asked, require short responses and others require long and elaborate responses. So my point is this: just answering a question is not enough. We need to ensure our students are answering in a way that suits the situation and expectations, matches the question, gives the appropriate amount of information, and that the answer is relevant. Now let's look at statements. In general, if you are not asking or answering a question, then you are probably either listening or making a statement. A statement could be the precursor to a question or to another statement. For example, "It's hot today," or "That shirt is expensive." These are both statements. I know that. You know that. And our students probably know that. But do our students know how to use statements effectively to introduce topics or start conversations? Or, let me ask you this: are your students adding information to their answers by adding some relevant information in the form of statements or sentences? Are they making well-structured and relevant statements to enhance a story or make a point? As teachers, it is our role not just to teach words and grammar, but to help our students understand how to communicate effectively based on their current level. Got it? Great. So what about I? I is for interjections, or those little words or phrases that show agreement, interest, or that we use to prompt or show surprise, etc. Words and phrases like yeah, wow, great, go on, things like that. My question then is, does your student understand how and when to interject appropriately? Do they know different types and different ways to interject? Do they know how often or how frequently to interject? Do their interjections sound natural or robotic? Now, this might sound silly, but interjections help gel conversations together. Not only can I tell you this from a teacher's perspective, but I can also tell you this from my own personal experience. Honestly, I have no idea how to interject or show interest in a conversation in the language I am learning, that being Korean. So I know that my conversation partner has no idea if I am following what they are saying or if I'm even interested in what they are saying. And this makes for very stilted conversations. So my point is this: the subtle art of interjecting and reacting appropriately should be explained and taught to students who have the ability to have conversations. This will really help them sound more fluent, and it will also result in smoother conversations, but that's only if it's done right. Finally, let's look at R for relevance. When I say R for relevance, what I mean is that the information being shared between the people involved needs to be relevant. And by this I mean it needs to be relevant to the expected communication norms of a given situation and relevant in terms of the information being shared. For teachers, this means that we should make sure we are teaching our students about pragmatics and how different conventions and styles of speech or text may be required in different situations or for different modes of communication, etc. It also means that we need to understand and teach our students about socially acceptable and socially expected ways of communicating. All of this should be done with the goal of helping your students become better communicators in a broad range of situations, and not just in the confines of a safe second language learning environment. And there you have it. QASIR, questions, answers, statements, interjections, and relevance. So to finish up, 3 final tips, or thinking points, about this approach. First, and as previously stated, QASIR is probably best suited to students at an intermediate stage or above. This is because, at this stage, I have found that students often already possess enough lexis and competence in using many grammar structures to be able to manipulate their language for clearer and more effective acts of communication, especially after considering QASIR. Second, keep in mind that different students will have different problems in relation to pragmatic competence, and often these problems, or learning opportunities as I like to call them, are based on a student's cultural background, age, previous learning experiences, or temperament, etc. This means that teachers shouldn't assume that QASIR will reveal the same findings or learning opportunities for all students. For example, just because many Korean students have difficulty in asking questions, it does not mean that all Korean students will have difficulties in asking questions. Often, my younger students are more confident in asking questions because they have been schooled in English differently, or maybe they still have that youthful trait of not worrying if they make mistakes. I guess my point is, apply QASIR to individual students wherever possible, not to entire populations of students, as it really is a great tool for helping students uncover their own unique communication learning opportunities. And finally, QASIR is just a tool. It is not the way to teach, it is just a way to teach. So don't forsake other teaching tools or methods that work, and don't focus too much on QASIR. I know this sounds strange. The guy who came up with this very idea is the same guy telling you not to rely on it too much. What I mean is, QASIR is a great tool to help your students. I know this because it has helped pretty much every student I have worked with over the last 4 years. So I highly recommend that you draw from this idea and apply it to your classes as needed. But don't let it become a crutch or the only thing you focus on. Even for myself, I personally remind my students of QASIR before we engage in task-based activities or the communication portion of my classes. But this does not mean that we analyze every utterance or conversation. Not at all. All it means is that my students have a way or a framework that can help them become more engaged and active in a conversation, find their learning opportunities, and to help them think about communication in a given context. If I or my students are constantly focusing on QASIR, then I may not be allowing my students the opportunity to really learn by experimenting with the language. Nor would I be helping my students develop reading skills, or helping them develop a good command of grammar, or develop their intonation. Actually, I may be overlooking the teaching of a host of other skills required when learning a second language. Not only that, if I rely on QASIR too much, my students may become overly focused on counting how many questions or statements, etc. they have made, instead of just trying to speak and enjoy language for the sake of enjoying language. So what should we do? My suggestion, which is based on years of experience developing this approach, is to use QASIR in moderation. Make it part of your class, but don't let it dictate every little thing you do. If you use QASIR in this manner, I am sure your students will reap the rewards just like my students have, and just like the students of the teachers who implemented this idea to help me get feedback during my research and development stage. And that, my friends, brings to a close another mini lecture. If you'd like to know more about QASIR or teaching English in general, check out my website, JoshEsl.com. Otherwise, I will hopefully see you again soon in another mini lecture. Thanks for listening.